Well, there was a contract, of course, and in that contract it said that the water had to be pure and wholesome. Bacteriology was just starting to come to its own at that time. It was the very beginnings of the total plate count, total coliforms. They called it Bacillus communis then. Sounds rather radical, I would say. But yeah, Bacillus coli, or Bacillus colon, was essentially total coliforms as we know it today, and they could analyze for it. So the city had a consultant come in and analyze the water, and lo and behold, they found some of these coliforms. And the lesson here, of course, is never hire a consultant. You always get bad news. Well, now wait a minute, I can't say that. But this consultant was a professor and a really expert guy by the name of George C. Whipple, not related to General Whipple, who many people know in New Jersey, but a fellow who ended up being a professor at Harvard University. So Dr. Whipple found the contamination. Jersey City said, wait a minute, you're not meeting your contractual obligations, and sued the private water company. Well, Leal was an employee of that private water company. It was part of his job to help defend the lawsuit. And this took place over 2 trials from 1906 to 1910. And so they just had a very, it's a very amazing story. There are 12 volumes of the transcripts of these 2 trials that cover about 2 feet of space on a bookshelf, over 6,000 pages. And it tells the story about how the judge decided, indeed, a few times a year, the reservoir did not purify the water enough. You know, sedimentation and holding water in a reservoir does kill bacteria, but not enough, obviously, and something had to be done. And so the judge said, either build sewers for Dover and not Rockaway, but Hibernia and Boonton itself, or put in other plans or devices which would be equivalent. Somehow Leal and the defense attorney, a fellow by the name of William H. Corbin, got that language into the final decree. Because Leal knew, and he testified to this, that he could put in chlorine into the water as it came out of the reservoir, and it would do a tremendous job in disinfecting the water. So he didn't ask anybody's permission. He didn't go to the city and say, hey, I'm going to put chlorine in the water supply. He went to George Fuller, who had offices on Broadway in New York City, and said, I want to hire you to build this treatment plant. It had never been done before. He wanted to use bleaching powder, which is essentially calcium hypochlorite, and no one had devised a chemical feeding system for that ever. But George Warren Fuller was a really smart guy, and he had designed a feed system for alum, aluminum sulfate, for the Little Falls plant that worked great. So I'm sure he decided that, well, that's what I need to do, because he had no time to do this. From the day that Leal hired him on July 19th, let me get the years right here, July 19th, 1908, until September 26th, 1908, 99 days, Fuller designed it, constructed it, got it operating, and it's worked. It worked. And so that was a tremendous accomplishment. Well, so they did that, and they went back to the court and they said, well, we have this other plan and device. And the judge said, okay, we'll have another trial and we will look to see if that is going to be acceptable. And that's what the second trial was about. And it's astonishing reading the transcripts, because every major expert of the day was there testifying on one side or the other. Of course, Fuller was there testifying for the defendants. Leal was with the defendants. Rudolph Herring, who many people know, who did a lot of work in Philadelphia for their water supply, testified for the defendants. George Whipple testified for the plaintiffs. A fellow by the name of William T. Sedgwick, and a number of professors from MIT were expert witnesses for the plaintiffs in the case. And so that really was the key, the second trial, when all of the pros and cons of putting chlorine in the water
were aired, and it was a turning point in drinking water history.
And that's a great synopsis. And Mike, my understanding is you're preparing a book on this, and we'll be able to read more about this as the book comes out. So thank you for that. Now, I guess in the remaining time that we have left, you mentioned something about ethics at the beginning, that this in part was an ethical issue. We hear this talk now about professional training, ethics. I mean, how would you describe ethics back then, ethics today, and what advice would you give to some of the professionals that are out there?
Well, I had a great teacher, and again, it was Sam Baxter. Mr. Baxter was the water commissioner at the city of Philadelphia through Republican and Democratic administrations. Everybody knew that he was the best of the best, and he had just a very strong moral compass, and he would do the right thing. And that's the way I really like to talk about it. Is we all have our training from our parents and from our schools and from our churches, and we know what the right thing is. Sometimes it's hard to do. Sometimes it can be embarrassing. Sometimes it can be kind of dangerous. Sometimes it can certainly be difficult. But knowing what the right thing to do is and doing it, no matter the consequences, I think is something that is timeless. It's the way that I learned it back in the 70s when I was at the Philadelphia Water Department, graduate school, and so on, and I think it's true today.
That's great advice for us. Another thing that you mentioned was that 90 days to get this. They didn't have computers. We've heard some of the other speakers talk about this. He didn't have the AutoCAD, but you're saying he went from 90 days from authorization to design and construction. Again, maybe you can touch on some of the keys to success, and again, maybe some of the things that we could try and implement on our projects.
Well, I wish we could do it the way Fuller did it. In those days, you didn't have a drawing for every single detail of a construction project. There were 9 drawings for this treatment plant, which was essentially a gravity feed of a solution of calcium hypochlorite. Calcium hypochlorite was bleaching powder. It was used in laundries to bleach shirts. And so, I mean, they knew that it was powerful and had been used in the past for cleaning up certain things and as a disinfectant, but never in drinking water. But once it was mixed at the proper concentration and it could be fed properly through an orifice plate, that gave the right dosage to the water. Yeah. The lessons to be learned today, I think, from what they did back then is that there's not, you don't always have a clear path. Fuller had never done this before. Certainly Leal had never had an engineer do this before, but they had some rock solid principles. And those principles were that public health is paramount. You just can't put the public at risk. And Leal knew that he had to do something to put a barrier between bacterial contamination and the public. And he knew he was right. He had apparently done a bunch of laboratory studies on this, convinced himself that it was right, but he had to do it full scale and then present that information to this court and get it judged to be correct. And I think that that's really important, knowing the basics, knowing the foundation of what you're doing and having a belief in what you're doing is right, and then proceeding. And again, in the case of Leal, it was pretty foolhardy to put in chlorine and not tell anybody, but he was never criticized for it. Nobody ever said, how could you do such a thing? There was certainly no regulatory agency to tell them that you can't do it. He had the bedrock of public health, being a physician, and he knew what to do. And I think that's important for all of us to remember, that get back to first principles and apply those principles to public health.
Thank you for that. And as we're getting ready to wrap up, you mentioned the Belleville connection, and I think there's a deeper Belleville connection with the chlorination piece, right? Because then it led to the rise of commercial development of equipment.
Yes.
And maybe you can just touch on that, because we're right near Belleville right here, and maybe in a couple of minutes just, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay. Well, Belleville was the home of Wallace and Tiernan for decades. They actually started in a very small laboratory and offices in New York City. But as things really started to explode after Jersey City and the Boonton Reservoir chlorination,
hundreds of utilities started putting in calcium hypochlorite feed systems, but you know, they were really kind of difficult because things would clog. And at the same time, for a variety of reasons, liquid chlorine came into being. Pressurizing chlorine, putting it in a pressurized tank and being able to serve it. Well, Wallace and Tiernan came up with the very first pressurized chlorine feed. A little dangerous now, as it wasn't a vacuum feed system, but it was something that worked, and that plant at Belleville was there for I don't know how many decades, and they had a tremendous effect on the proper application of chlorine in the water utility industry in this country, and I'm convinced made it a success. Without their expertise and their technology, I don't think we would be as successful as we are today with chlorine.
So is all of these groups working together, not giving up, kind of the take-home message? And finally, the last question is, as the middle-aged professional on the Retired Professionals Committee, I'd like you to give some advice to those people that are starting out in their careers or kind of midway through their careers, some of the things that you may have learned along the way to help them out.
Well, my advice to young people especially is to get a broad range of experience. I came in kind of at the research level. I was running a couple of groups, and then I ran a laboratory. I would really strongly recommend to young people that they get their hands wet, they get their hands dirty, and really get out in the field and learn the business from a wide variety of viewpoints. And also, if they certainly have to get their education, but don't just focus on one. Don't just specialize on one. This is supposedly the age of specialization. But in my view, the drinking water business demands people that really know a lot about the business and a lot about different aspects of the business. I think it's the best way that we can protect the public.
Well, thank you very much for coming here today, Mike, and on behalf of this section, thank you very much.
Thank you.